All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with James Osborne. We're at Oregon State University in Corvallis. It's December 12th, 2023. And James, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
First question is, why wine?
Why wine? For me, it was a fascination born out of microbiology, actually. So I didn't grow up really being surrounded by wine in any way, or even really beer or any alcoholic beverage. I grew up on a dairy farm in New Zealand. And so I grew up around milk and cheese and things along those lines. And so it wasn't really until I started studying it at university, started studying microbiology, and took some classes that introduced me to the fermentation process and the products that can be made through fermentation, that I really got interested in the use of fermentation for positive, production of products and things. So at university studying microbiology, the university I was at had kind of two tracks, and one of them was kind of more of a medical microbiology track, and then one was more of an applied, so water microbiology, fermentation microbiology, and I'd take classes in both of those. And I remember taking all the medical microbiology classes, and they were interesting, but pretty gross, and it didn't really interest me. But the use of microbes to produce a product, value-added product, and just learning about that whole process was pretty fascinating. And as a 19, 20-year-old, learning a bit more about how beer was made, how wine was made, that also was fascinating. So that kind of opened, I guess, the door to learning more about wine production and the role of microbes, because I found that whole aspect of it really fascinating. So that led me to, after my bachelor's degree, studying wine microbiology for my master's. So I was kind of looking around, thinking about jobs, and a professor who taught that applied micro class had an opening in his lab looking for a master's student. And so I just kind of jumped in and thought, yeah, this seems like a good idea at the time. And so that was really my first introduction to really wine and learning a bit more about it. And so I've come at wine from a very academic point of view, I guess. In that it wasn't the love of wine necessarily that drove me to microbiology, but the microbiological aspects of winemaking that was really fascinating. And that whole world of what's going on during fermentation and what's going on in the wine is still really fascinating to me, and a real driver of research and research interest and research passion is understanding all these different microbes that are in there during that process, what they're doing, how do we understand what they're doing, how do we maybe manipulate them in one way or the other to make a bit of wine or prevent spoilage or whatever it might be. So yeah, my journey to wine is, I think like most people's journey to wine, there isn't a normal journey to wine, at least in my discussion with people in the wine industry, and Oregon's a great example of that. How did you get into winemaking? You never quite know what the answer is going to be to that. So I'm just one more story, I think, to that. There's a million different ways to get into the wine industry.
When you were headed to university, what were you thinking you would be doing? What was your kind of goal at that point?
I was fairly open-ended. So I grew up on the dairy farm, like milking cows and doing that, and I enjoyed that. But as a 18-year-old, I didn't want to become a dairy farmer. Getting up at 5 every morning, 7 days a week, was not really, I didn't see myself doing that, at least as an 18-year-old. But agricultural sciences, understanding some of the sciences behind that was fascinating to me. And at school, I enjoyed biology and chemistry and things along those lines. So I pursued that, and I went to Massey University in Palmerston North, which is near the bottom of the North Island in New Zealand. And it's the major agricultural university. It's kind of very similar to a land-grant university here, in that it was formed really for horticulture, agricultural sciences, and then it's grown beyond that, but that was its initial foundations. So, a very hort ag-driven university. So I started off studying like agricultural sciences, and my route to microbiology came through studying soil microbiology. So I took a soils class, and I took a soils micro class, and really kind of got exposed to more microbiology than I had in high school, and I veered off even further into microbiology and ended up in wine. So at the time, I really, I was thinking something along the ag services that support the ag and hort industry, maybe research scientist or technician at one of the, at the time, they were government-driven research institutes in New Zealand that supported hort and ag. Those are the type of careers or things I was thinking about once I got into school a little bit, I think starting university, sometimes for sure, and sometimes it was pretty open-ended for me. The New Zealand university system, you kind of have to make up your mind pretty quick because most of the degrees are only 3-year degrees. It's more on the British system, and so you can't really take a couple of years to figure out your major. So luckily, I knew kind of the area I wanted to focus in. I didn't necessarily foresee myself being an academic working at research university as I've ended up, but that's kind of where the path led in the end.
So after the kind of initial interest in fermentation and microbiology on kind of a macro scale, tell me about the master's level work as you sort of focused on wine. What was your initial response to an interest in the wine as you started to learn more about it?
Sure. So my project was looking at malolactobacteria, so the bacteria involved in the malolactic fermentation, and we were looking at some specific metabolism of products in wine that may have either detrimental or positive effects. So we're looking at the metabolism of acetaldehyde. So it's a compound that yeast produce that's commonly in wine. That may have some either beneficial aspects to color or may have some maybe negative sensory aspects. So that was the project. Was at the time there wasn't much knowledge about the ability of the bacteria to metabolize this compound, and so we did kind of a screening of a lot of different lactic acid bacteria and looked at the metabolism of that. So at a research level, that's sort of what we're looking at, but then we got to do that work in model wine, and then we moved on to making wine and doing that in wine, as well as collaborating with a research group in Hawke's Bay. And so Massey University is not really located in wine country. If you look on the map where wine is made in New Zealand, there's nearly none around Palmerston North, but the Hawke's Bay region, which is about a 2-hour drive away, there's quite a large industry there. A little warmer climate there than Marlborough, where most of the wine is grown in New Zealand. So they have some more Bordeaux varieties. Chardonnay is a popular grape there, and so we did some additional work out in Hawke's Bay, working on making Chardonnay wine and applying some of our benchtop kind of results and seeing if the same things happened on a slightly larger scale in wine. So that was kind of my first real exposure to wineries and the wine industry around the Hawke's Bay, but it was really just a little snapshot of, and it probably wasn't until my PhD work here in the States that I had more exposure to the broader, to more wineries, I guess. So my master's work was probably more benchtop work, but we did do some small-scale winemaking and did a little bit of collaborative work with a group out in the Hawke's Bay.
Did you find anything that was unique to wine versus sort of other things you had studied at that point?
I think maybe I didn't realize it at the time, but in the context when you look at microbial ecology and the production of different products, wine always, to me, stands out as kind of unique in that you're always dealing with background microorganisms. There's not really this sterilization or pasteurization or kill step that happens at the start of fermentative processes, like cheese making, for example. We pasteurize the milk, and then you add a starter, or brewing, where again you're heating up the water and you're really kind of a pasteurization almost step there before you're adding. So in wine, there's things we can do to maybe amend the amount of microbes that might be in there. We can add a starter culture to dominate the ferment, but there's no sterilization step. So you're always dealing with a mixture of microorganisms, even if you're intending only one or two of those ones to do the deal for you. There's always background organisms, and they always play a role. So that aspect of winemaking from a microbiologist's point of view was pretty fascinating, because how microbes interact and how they react to each other. They're like us in that some of them get along, some of them don't get along, some of them are very neutral, they don't really care, and understanding how that might work and how that might impact wine quality. So early on, studying that in class and learning about it didn't really strike me, but then learning more about it and starting to study it and thinking about microbial interactions and the kind of uniqueness of wine from that sense. So grapes come in every year, they're slightly different, so they're going to be impacted by the climate, etc. So there's always a slightly different microbial load come into the winery as well. So it's a pretty dynamic situation and dynamic kind of area to study microbiology. So that's kind of, I think, from a unique point of view, that wine sits in that area where it's more of a management process, microbial management, versus a complete control process. You never have complete control. It's always a management thing and doing what you can to, promote the growth of organisms you want to, so fermentation, you want Saccharomyces, so you promote conditions that will be conducive, and then later on it's all about creating conditions where you're trying to prevent the growth of other organisms. So it's this management, and looking at what tools we have to manage our microbial populations. So in some ways, for total control, it might be nice to just be able to get rid of everything off the grapes and juice and start with zero and just add in what you want and then control it completely. But grapes don't allow that, and barrels don't allow that. So you're always dealing with other microbes during the process.
So at that point, you mentioned you hadn't really intended to go kind of the academic route. Did you ever consider getting into winemaking or viticulture or anything along those lines?
I did a little bit. I explored during my master's as I was getting closer to the end and thinking, okay, what's the next steps? I looked into jobs and what might be out there, and it was really during that process that I got the next opportunity to continue my research work. And I really enjoyed doing research. As an undergraduate, you don't really get exposed to it very much, but then once you have an experience in a lab, you find out whether that's something you like to do. And so I really enjoyed that whole process of finding out something new, of discovering something. And so when there was an opportunity to continue with that PhD, I decided that that was the right route for me, even though I could have seen myself going into the industry at that point. So small world, the world of wine microbiology. So my soon-to-be new advisor in the States knew my advisor in New Zealand, and they connected, and he was looking for a PhD student working on Malactobacteria. I was working on Malactobacteria, and so I started just emailing his Dr. Charlie Edwards up at Washington State University, and sight unseen, he's like, okay, sounds like you're the right person for the project. And so I was like, okay, sounds good. I'll come to Washington State for my PhD. And funnily enough, at the time, I asked my advisor about Washington, about where it was at, Washington State University, and he initially told me it was in Seattle. So of course, the dreaded Huskies are in Seattle. So at the time, I looked up, Seattle, and I know about Seattle. Sounds like a cool city to go to. And then Pullman is a little bit inland of Seattle, but so that I quickly realized that WSU wasn't in Seattle, it was in Pullman. And so that began my second journey, if you like, and talking about academics and getting into academics. At that time, I really enjoyed research, and so that was kind of the driver for going into a PhD. It wasn't necessarily wanting to be a university professor or anything like that. And while I was at Washington State University, part of their requirement for a PhD is to do a little bit of teaching, to be a teaching assistant, to teach some lectures and labs. And so I did that during my second year there, I think. And enjoyed that as well. I really enjoyed the interaction with the students, kind of the preparation of the material, and just the teaching of it. And that kind of broadened my horizons a little bit as to, potential job opportunities, a potential career outside of just strictly research, where the university offers you the positions to be able to do research, conduct research, but also teaching and other aspects to it. So I definitely saw that as a viable option. I still was keeping my options open as far as where to go after my PhD, but it was during that time that I got to do a little bit of teaching and found that I kind of enjoyed that. I didn't necessarily see myself as a teacher early on. My eldest sister was a elementary school teacher, and there's lots of teachers in my family. So I guess I ended up joining the ranks. But I think the flexibility of the university, of being a professor, being able to have teaching and work with students, but then also conduct independent research and work with graduate students and things like that was also appealing.
Before coming to Washington State, had you spent any time in the States?
I had not, no. Actually, coming to the States was my first time out of New Zealand. So I hadn't, my family, we traveled around New Zealand for holidays and things, but we never left New Zealand. So yeah, that was the first time leaving the shores of New Zealand, flying all the way over here flying over the Palouse and the wheat fields. I remember flying into Pullman. It was kind of at night time. And so yeah, it was a bit of and it wasn't really a culture shock because America's not, there's a lot of, New Zealand is very similar to America in a lot of ways, westernized with the same TV shows, and although there's a bit more of a British influence in New Zealand too. We're interesting mash of those two things. Probably the most surprising thing to me when I came to the States was college sports, which now looking back on it, I was aware of college sports and the size of it and stuff, but just New Zealand really, we don't have anything like that. We have the national teams and maybe some regional teams. They have stadiums and stuff, but Pullman, this little town of 30,000 people, it had a stadium. Football stadium was larger than the largest stadium in New Zealand. So then the national rugby team they play in a stadium. It's bigger now, but at the time, a stadium that was smaller than the stadium that was at WSU, which is one of the smallest stadiums in the Pac-12, Pac-2, whatever, that we have. So even then, it was a smaller, but that whole thing, which I jumped into it, went to all the games, and really enjoyed it. But yeah, at the time, it was, well, that and fraternity and sororities. I'd only seen those in the movies. And I think I assumed they were more of a movie thing, or maybe just Ivy League schools had sororities and fraternities. But WSU had, up on College Hill, have quite a lot of Greek houses. And that was my two cultural shocks. The enormity of college football and the sororities and fraternities. Yeah.
That sounds pretty typical. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's all subtle stuff, little things. And my wife, who I met when I was at WSU, she's an American. She found the same thing coming to New Zealand. We lived in New Zealand for about 18 months or so after my PhD. And it's the little subtle differences not that big obvious ones. There's always these little, how you say something, how you ask for something, all these little things that happen when you live there. So nothing major, but just I still continually find those little things that are different.
What was tell us about the experience of the PhD program, and I'm also curious about sort of your introduction to the Washington wine industry and your interaction with the Washington wine industry.
Sure. So my PhD project was still focused around malolactic fermentation, and we were looking at interactions with Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So that kind of also got me into that world of microbial interactions. So specifically, we were looking at why some malolactic fermentations seem to be more problematic than others. So the alcoholic fermentation is usually fairly reliable, but often the malolactic fermentation, that secondary one with the bacteria, can be a little more problematic, and sometimes there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for why it's problematic. And one of the potential mechanisms is inhibitory interactions with the yeast. So the yeast that does the primary fermentation, something occurs, maybe it's production of a compound or consumption of some essential nutrient, that then means that the bacteria, when you add them in to do the secondary ferment, have problems. So we were looking at trying to understand what the mechanism of inhibition might be, and it was fairly open-ended, which often PhD kind of projects tend to be that way. That's the goal of them, is to be a little bit exploratory, and kind of that changed paths as you go along. You conduct one experiment and then maybe change to a different, based on those results. And so I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the exploratory nature of it and fairly independent research of it. So there was another PhD in the lab who'd been there a few years, so kind of trained up on methods, and once got comfortable with the different methods that we're going to be using, it was fairly independent study, and then just checking in with the advisor and updating on things and coming up with new projects. So that whole process, we were trying to identify potential mechanisms. So what we found were a couple of products that certain Saccharomyces strains produce in higher amounts, and something unique as well that could be inhibitory to bacteria. So one of those was a known compound, sulfur dioxide, which is used as an antimicrobial. And others had shown that some yeast produce enough of that compound that they can inhibit the bacteria. And we looked at that, and we also looked at the nutritional status of the must, the grape must, that actually impacts how much SO2 is being produced by the yeast. So you could create conditions in the must that could lead to very high amounts of SO2 that then would be inhibiting in the bacteria. And then we also looked at there were some situations where that didn't explain the issue. So the yeast, very little SO2 being produced, but still inhibitory. So we looked at nutrients as a potential and kind of crossed that off. And then we looked at production of other potential inhibitory compounds. And so we were able to identify a really small peptide that this particular yeast produced that was inhibitory of the bacteria. And that was kind of a unique finding at the time. So this whole interactions piece between the yeast and bacteria, we kind of uncovered some new potential things that needed to be considered if you were to want your wine to go through malolactic. So this project was funded by I think it was the Northwest Centre for Small Fruits Research, which is heavily influenced by industry. Industry are on the board and help decide the research priorities. So as a student, I was able to give research reports to the industry group and interact with industry in that way. So talk to them about our results, and also, do you guys ever have any problems with malolactic fermentation? What wines might it be? Under what conditions? So that can sometimes be helpful to help narrow down an area that you might want to focus in on more. So that was a good kind of one of my first introductions to a lot of two-way interaction with the industry on what the problems are, or even refining what the problems might be, that we could start to kind of dig in a bit more with research. I got to travel to Walla Walla and to the Tri-Cities area. The two main hubs there for wine production. It was a while ago. Walla Walla's changed a lot since I was there as a student in 2002, I suppose, is when I went to Walla Walla. I know I've been back there more recently, and it's certainly grown and changed a lot. But it also introduced me to a lot of Washington Syrah, which became my favorite wine at the time. Still is one of my favorite wines. And so got to taste a lot more wine, and that, as part of that project too. Not directly related to that project, but just when you go out and visit and talk with winemakers, it's always fun to try to do some tastings and taste through different wines. And so Washington Syrah became top of my list.
My next question was actually going to be about developing a taste for wine. So I'm curious, since you came at wines differently than other people, you came at it from the scientific interest background. Tell me about developing a taste for wine, and does knowing so much about what's going on inside the wine affect your ability to enjoy it?
That's an interesting question about the inner workings of things, or you get trained on identifying faults. So one part of my research program is looking at microbial faults. Mm-hmm. So things like Brettanomyces spoilage, for example, or lactic acid bacteria spoilage. And so you do get kind of hone in on those things. So I'm not a huge fan of Brettanomyces in wine. I like it in beer. I'm a fan of sour beer, and I don't know if that's just because I don't do research in that area, but in wine, it's a bit challenging to get past wine that's got too much bready characteristic to it. I don't know. As a whole, I think I can separate things somewhat to enjoy wine without being overly analytical about it. It depends. When you're with friends or people that know you're in what you do, they're always curious about things and asking, which is fun. But it's also fun just to enjoy the wine and not have to overly analyze it. But there's still, I still feel like I'm really still, and you continue to be learning about all of these things because I came at it from, I didn't grow up or really have a lot of experience drinking wine, even through academics, through my graduate work. Since I've been in this position, drinking a lot of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and learning more and more about these things, learning from, as we go on, continually develop my palate. But microbial faults, EA is the other. Ethyl acetate is the other one that I'm always looking for in wines, because we've done work on cold soaking, and so the non-Saccharomyces yeast involved in that process, and some of them producing ethyl acetate, and so you kind of evaluate for EA, evaluate for Brett, because it's just the two areas that we've worked a lot in.
So as you're coming to the end of your PhD program, what were your kind of your thoughts for your next step, and tell me about the opportunities you had at that point?
Sure. So at that time I was newly married, I guess. About a year we were married, and the plan was to move back to New Zealand and look for academic jobs in New Zealand. At the time, nearing my end of the PhD, there was an opportunity to go and work at the University of Auckland. They had a new enology program, a new wine science program there, relatively new. It was just a graduate level program, so not an undergraduate program. And they were looking for, at the time, someone to help manage their research winery and do some teaching and help and kind of collaborate with the researchers in that group. So I took that position and moved back to New Zealand. I took that position with the thought that was really a stepping stone to something else. So that was a good. I enjoyed that job. It was fairly short-lived. At the time, there was a couple of professors at the university that were putting together an application for a postdoc. So that was where initially I thought this might lead to. So there was some government funding, New Zealand government funding for postdocs in lots of different areas. And so we put together an application for a postdoc, and that was supposedly going to be the next step, but it didn't pan out. We didn't get funded for that. So then I was kind of looking for what the next thing might be, and so the winery position. The research winery position kind of ended, and I was looking into, at that time, the timing was quite nice to look into just doing harvest, just working at a winery. So that was kind of the end of December. New Zealand harvest starts usually February, something like that. So I sent my CV out to a bunch of different wineries around that region, looking for work, and there was a large winery there called Delegates Oyster Bay. And their main facility is down in Marlborough, but they had a large facility in Auckland that they fermented, but they also finished. They got a lot of wine shipped up from Hawke's Bay and from Marlborough, and with a finishing and bottling operation as well. So they had a lab there, and they were looking for someone to work in the lab during harvest, and so they wondered why, with a PhD, I wanted to do that at the time. I'm like, I just want to get some experience and, working in a large winery, and this would be great. So I jumped on board and worked in the lab there at Delegates from February, about 6 months. So it was an extended harvest. And that was really valuable. So I'd only had really interactions with smaller wineries and not worked a harvest. And so looking back now, jumping into this job after that, that was a really valuable experience, working at a larger winery, seeing kind of the inner workings. So this was we were bottling about 1 million cases a year at that facility. Lots of comings and goings, lots of decisions on 100,000 litre lots, not 1 litre lots like I've been working at. And it was really eye-opening on the production level of winemaking and the logistics involved and things like that. I enjoyed working in the lab, where they had a really great couple of other people in the lab manager and another lab tech, and refine some of the methods, introduce some new methods there. So got to do a little bit of added value while I was there, and just really enjoyed the experience. Even working harvest, we were, it was 24-hour shifts. It was 2 12-hour shifts. So they were 24 hours for probably about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. And in the lab, we had to, I think I was on a 1-to-1, so 1 a.m. to 1 p.m. shift, although you had to be there earlier. So I got used to working nights for that period of time, and got the full harvest experience of working really long hours with a really good crew and enjoying it, and eating a lot of. That's one thing I miss about New Zealand. Eating a lot of pies, meat pies. were kind of the driving food behind working in the winery. There was a really good little bakery down the road, and they did pretty good service from the winery, because every lunch we were down there for a meat pie, at least one meat pie. But I think we all probably lost weight during harvest. That's usually the way it goes too. So we were eating bad, but yeah, lots of effort in the winery. So yeah, I learned a lot in that process, really, which was really valuable to have that industry experience, even if it was just a short, 6-month kind of stint. That really helped stepping into this current job, which had a lot of industry extension work, so a lot of working with the wine industry, and so to just have a little bit, starting off as a fresh new assistant professor, to go out and talk with winemakers and at least have some commonality there and a little bit of grounding, so it wasn't just straight out of a lab with a PhD and thrown into that. So certainly, I didn't know what I was doing. Nobody really knows what they're doing when they start, but at least I had some understanding and experience there, and that's only growing. So that was a really valuable experience. Looking back at doing that, that I've been able to carry some of that into my current job.
Given all that you knew at that point on a kind of academic level, how did the actual act of harvest and winemaking compare to what you expected?
You have a lot less control, especially in the winery of that large. So there's lots of things you'd like to do or maybe control, or that on a small scale, when we do research stuff, you have total control. Our whole goal is control everything except one variable so that we can figure out if something happened. I know in a production setting that's not the goal, but even in the production setting, it's all about compromise. So good compromise, but still compromise. Like, you have to make these decisions, and so I think that was a little bit of a learning experience. Just learning how those decisions are made, and being in rooms with there was 2 or 3 winemakers, a couple of winemakers and a couple of assistant winemakers, and being in that room hearing the discussions and being able to be part of that from the lab group as far as how decisions are made, and yeah, a lot of things are a compromise, and you can't always make the perfect decisions you'd like to, or do exactly everything you'd like to, because it's just the reality of it when you're working with these, and it's not just large wineries, but just the production setting of it, and the financial realities of it, and the logistics of it, and being the major bottling facility for this large winery, we were on very tight schedules because most of the wines were due to be shipped somewhere. So they weren't internal. New Zealand exports most of its wine, so it would be shipping to Australia or shipping to the UK or shipping to the US. So there were all these deadlines and timelines that had to be met, and working within those constraints was also, I think, a valuable experience. We were charged with monitoring the bottling line for any microbial contamination, so taking bottles off the bottling line and screening and filtering them, and making sure the sterile filters were doing their job and things like that. And so, when something pops up, what has to happen to that lot, and the time that's lost, if there are any problems during that process, and what that means for all these downstream decisions that have to be made. So I still remember that, like the tight timeline they were on to try and get their wine shipped into the UK market before the UK summer started. So we were making wine in February, March, and then trying to get the Sauvignon Blanc onto the shelves by June at the latest in the UK. So very short windows, because it's a very competitive market, and wanting to get those wines in the supermarkets ready for summer when everyone wants a nice cool glass of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And so yeah, all of those things that trickle down to the production level of what has to happen at the production level to get the wine to the UK by June, and when it has to be on the ship to get to the UK, and all these things like that. So things that, certainly as a researcher, you're very focused on your projects and your little things you're looking at, but it all fits into there's a whole lot going on to get wine, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, to the UK or to the US. We're shipping to as well.
So you mentioned the position here. Tell me about how that came about, or kind of what your next step was at that point.
Yeah, so I was working at the winery and just looking for jobs still and keeping an eye out for different things. And this position popped up, advertised. So an extension research teaching position here at Oregon State University. I was aware of Oregon State when I was at Washington State. I'd met some students who at a national conference, the American Society of Enology and Viticulture Conference. I remember hearing some talks from OSU students about Oregon Pinot Noir at the time. It was actually a conference in Portland. I'd visited Portland before for that conference, but never really any other parts of Oregon. But my wife was familiar with Oregon and enjoyed the Northwest. So when this job came up, it seemed like a great opportunity. It had the academic aspect of it with teaching and also research, and then the location. So my wife's parents still live in Pullman, Washington, and so being back in the Northwest, close to them, my family's all back in New Zealand, so it's kind of we're either away from her family or away from my family as far as that goes. So it was to come back to the States for this position. At least it would be close to her family, and in the Northwest, I enjoyed the Northwest, the climate and the people, and just the general culture here. So I flew over for an interview. Thought I'd give it my best shot, never know. And I really enjoyed the interview. Got to a day out in the industry. So the first day of the interview was all here on campus, meeting with lots of different people, lots of different groups. I can't remember it all. It was a blur. And then the second day with some faculty, we went up into the Willamette Valley. Actually, we went up to, there's a restaurant in Dundee across from Argyle. What's it called?
The Dundee Bistro?
Yeah, Dundee Bistro. Yeah, so we met at the Dundee Bistro for lunch and met with a group of winemakers there because the position had an extension component to it. So working with industry was going to be a big part of the position. So they had a bunch of questions for me, and I had a little blurb to give them. And so that was kind of my first interaction with wine industry folks. I still remember chatting with Roland Souls. And so he had spent time obviously in Australia and things like that, and so he was quite the character to chat to there. I distinctly remember chatting with Roland and his moustache. And so that was my first kind of interaction with the Oregon industry, and I did it. I guess I did a good enough job that I got offered the job, which was amazing. So that was in like May, I think, and my wife and I moved back here in August. My wife was like 7 months pregnant at the time, 6-7 months pregnant. So it was quite a move back. And actually my son was born about 2 months after I started the job. So he's a good, if I ever forget how long I've been in the job, I have to remember how old he is, and then I'm good.
What year was that?
2006.
2006.
So September 2006, I started here.
So tell me about you mentioned the extension part of the role. Tell me about the initial role for which you were hired and sort of your first year on the job. What were the big milestone tentpoles for you?
Yeah, so it's interesting in academics. I got an office and do your job sort of thing. And so, my role was split between teaching, research, and extension. So I had some teaching obligations, some set classes that I was going to develop and teach. So there was a class that was already being taught that I was taking over, as well as kind of developing it. I wouldn't say a new class, but we're adding some credits and making it a larger class. So there's that aspect to it that I knew, like the definitive timeline on, okay, you're teaching this class in this term. And that was a lecture and lab class that involved wine production. So I had that. I knew I could work towards. Research was all about getting my research lab cleaned out and set up and figuring out what equipment I needed, and then getting going with grants and students, et cetera, in the first year, is starting to get that momentum. And then from the extension point of view, from industry point of view, working with industry was all about me learning the industry and getting out there and introducing myself. So I tried to visit as many wineries as I could in the first year. So I'd just take a day and go and hit half a dozen wineries, talk to winemakers in the Willamette Valley. I'd take a day, an overnight trip down to Southern Oregon, went out to Walla Walla, So it was about just meeting with winemakers. There hadn't been someone in this role for a few years, since I don't know, a couple of years at least. And so just to let people know that there's an enology extension specialist at OSU, kind of that can be a resource for them. And then also just chatting to them about what are some things you're dealing with, what are some problems, what are some issues, what are some things you think that would be good to work on, either education side of things or from a research side of things. So it was definitely a bit of a finding my feet as far as that. There's some industry organization, the Oregon Wine Board, for example, that can provide they provide a lot of input on research priorities. They work with the industry to develop those. So there was some guidance as far as these are kind of some current industry priorities for enology. But for me, it was really helpful to talk with the winemakers. But partly it was just to introduce myself and make some contacts. At the time, there weren't 1,000 wineries in Oregon, so I wouldn't say I had every winery, but I did a fair amount of them. But that was when there was probably less than 200 wineries at that point, for sure. I think if I started that now, it would be never ending. By the time I'd got through them all, there'd be new wineries starting up, and I'd just be continuing. But that has been a big change, even in my time here, is the growth of the industry. But at the time, had grown a lot and was seen as hadn't grown a lot since the early 2000s. But looking back at the numbers, we were still on the bottom of that upward curve. So I did a lot of driving and meeting winemakers and tasting wine and just doing those sort of things. So that was my goal initially, was just to get out there and introduce myself and look for opportunities to do that at regional meetings and the Oregon Wine Symposium. I got involved in the organizing committee for the technical sessions there. That was when it was, at the time, was down in Eugene. And so I got to, give a talk down there as part of a session and just those sort of opportunities that came up. So in your first year, I found in my first year, I was generating a lot of my own work, if that was all. And then after a few years, then there was too much work, and then it was a matter of prioritizing. So the first year or two was all generating your own work. So that's getting your research lab going, getting grants going, and then getting students on board, getting the work started. And same with the extension piece. And then the other extension piece that I did, probably more focused on the first few years, was doing events like workshops. So soon after I was hired, Dr. Patty Skinkis was hired as a viticulture extension person. So we ended up doing a lot of joint workshops. We'd go out to places. You do a morning of vit and an afternoon of wine or enology or something like that. So we did a few of those out in different parts of the state, and so that was a good avenue too, as well, to promote the program and who we were, is to actually put on some events. And there'd been kind of a lack of those sort of training events for a while as well. Been a gap for a few years where there hadn't really been much. So that was another, I think, a successful way to kind of get out there and do that.
What were your initial impressions of the Oregon wine industry, the people, the wines, the places, and what were the kind of, as you were asking all those questions, what did you see as the key sort of needs or places for growth?
Yeah, my first impressions of the industry, very friendly. I enjoyed meeting lots of different people, lots of different backgrounds. I enjoyed the smallness of the seemingly kind of tight-knit community, that everyone seemed to know everyone in certain regions, and there was a lot of sharing of ideas and sharing of even resources and things like that. I think that's borne out from the early days of the industry, that that's how it's grown and how it's been successful. It's very much an open community that really works well together. And I found that more and more and more as we've been involved in lots of other, as the industry's growing, there's still that mentality about sharing what's going right, sharing what's not going right, what's going on, what's working for you, what's not, and adopting those ideas and things. So there's been a real sharing of ideas that I've enjoyed and really enjoyed being part of. So there's not this we figured this out, but we're just going to keep it to ourselves mentality. There's definitely a shared mentality of, it's the saying, the cliche saying of rising tide lifts all boats, but it's very true that an industry, I think Oregon is a great industry as an example of that, that we're all striving to make better wines. And so we want everyone to make great wines because, if a consumer has an Oregon wine that's not so great, it doesn't just reflect on that particular producer. So we want everyone's quality to be improved. So to your point about what the main issues were, I mean, there's always some specific things that pop up, but generally, especially on the wine side, maybe the vit side, there might be some more specific things. They encounter more year-to-year changes or things like a new pest or disease or some change, some cooler year or hotter year. They often have some specific things. On the wine side, those have carryover into the winery, but often we're dealing with more just kind of long-term, bigger questions that have always kind of been out there. So, what is it that gives great mouthfeel in a red wine, for example? How do you understand that? Now, I'm not a phenolic chemist, so I don't have to answer that. But there's maybe a microbial aspect to it. But that, those sort of questions, those quality questions, changes in the vineyard practices, how do those translate into the winery? From my point of view, kind of the microbial aspect of it, is there something unique about some of our microbial populations, or, native fermentations or cold soaking? What contribution, if any, does that make a difference in your wines? So some of my early research kind of looked into cold soaking and microbial populations during cold soaking, because that was a pretty common practice for Pinot Noir and is a common practice for Pinot Noir here. So that's unique-ish to Oregon. There are a lot of cold soaking all around the world, but I think proportionally, there's a lot of Oregon Pinot Noirs cold soaked. And so from a microbial point of view, what's going on during that process, and is it having an impact on wine quality, wine taste and aromas? And then if it is, then why? And then once you understand that, then maybe how do you maybe take advantage of that? How do you manipulate conditions in the cold soak to promote something or decrease something else? So those are some of the things that I recall that kind of helped guide some of my early research. Because sometimes as a new professor, some of your initial research is kind of carrying on from your PhD. There's always things you didn't get to, so you kind of carry on. So some of my early projects were kind of some follow-ons from my PhD work, but then really more then led to more work that was specific to issues or problems or priorities that the Oregon industry had. So I'd mainly focused on malactobacteria in my graduate work, and while I still have got projects related to that, now I've branched out. I work with non-Saccharomyces yeast or Brettanomyces spoilage or things, because those are all things that came up as being needs and areas that we needed more knowledge in and interest in. Mm-hmm. So. But always the universal question of quality, which is very difficult to define from an academic point of view. What is wine quality? But trying to understand better some of the drivers of certain aromas or mouthfeel, and then the microbial kind of contribution to that was where my piece would fit into it.
So tell me about your role and how it's evolved in the time you've been at Oregon State, kind of steps along the way. And kind of along with that, how the needs of the industry have sort of driven that or helped that evolve.
Yeah. So my position up until recently hasn't really changed as far as the breakdown of teaching and research and extension, still having those three core duties. And so still teaching a wine production analysis class. That's changed, and adapted over time, but it's still fundamentally, how to make wine and what you analyze and how you analyze it and why and all the aspects to that. On the extension side, that's changed and morphed over time as well. The industry has grown larger, so looking at ways to reach that industry beyond just an occasional extension workshop. So, how do we distribute our information digitally, social media? I wouldn't say I'm an avid social media user, but that's becoming more and more part of I have to think about that more and more, ways to get information out. How do people receive information and look for information? Because there's a lot of information out there, but not all of it is very trustworthy or use, so that's been a piece of on the extension side of things is, yes, there's still workshops around certain topics and areas that are helpful, but also looking at other ways to extend that information of new research and new findings and things that are going on. So when I first came, and I think it's still true now, there's certainly a wide breadth of experience and scientific knowledge or technical knowledge in the industry from people new to the industry or maybe coming at it from a completely different a completely different background to people who've been in the industry for 20 plus years and have a master's degree, whatever, and have very high level of technical insight into things. And so a challenge for me was, how do I meet the needs of that population? Mm-hmm. So I can do I wouldn't say beginner, but like an entry-level kind of workshop on, assessing grape maturity. So what do we assess? How do we assess it? Why do we assess it? How might this change your picking decisions through to, adjustments in the winery? That sort of workshop. So very hands-on, and that might be appropriate for either certain people within the winery or certain wineries that sort of level of training would be needed. And then there's kind of the more higher, these are the latest research findings in, the formation of volatile sulfur compounds during aging. And so what do we now understand about sulfur chemistry, and how might that reflect some things we could do to prevent that? So there's quite a range of different topics and different audiences that you kind of try and reach. And you can't be all things to all people, but as one person, I'm the sole enology extension person for the state, and so part of it is looking at where can you reach a high amount of people, or most impactful, or in the most effective way. So sometimes that is an article that we put up on the website that we promote or push out through email, or sometimes it is a hands-on workshop. So we're doing something on using a spectrophotometer in the winery lab. It's probably best to do that as a hands-on workshop and learn about and do it together versus maybe a document that you follow along with or something along those lines. So that's morphed and changed as the industry's grown, but I think there's still that same kind of fundamental need for some kind of introductory, that sort of level stuff, through to what are some of the latest findings in some of these areas from our group here at OSU, but also just in general in the colleagues at other universities' findings, and bringing them and having them involved in trainings or giving talks or seminars, things like that. And from the research side, that's just continually. That's a continually working on different projects and evolving, using better understanding of what we've done previously, and so that's ever adjusting, I guess, ever adapting.
From both the perspective of the students you work with and the industry people you work with, how have you seen sort of entrance into the Oregon wine industry change? Have you seen the people who are coming into Oregon wine? What do they look like now versus when you started? What are the differences there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there's been a huge difference in. Certainly there's just a lot more people that I interact with on the industry side of things, and the student side of things too. Our program has grown both the undergraduate level and the graduate level. Now that I've been here for a little while, what I really enjoy now is seeing all of the ex-students, so the alumni, out in industry and see where they're going and what they're doing in their careers, both here, but also in California, Washington, on the East Coast, other parts of the world. It's always hard to keep in touch with everyone. We always tell our students when they graduate, make sure you keep in touch. But and in the wine industry itself, there's a lot of movement within the wine industry. So I may have an email that's 3 jobs old. So it's sometimes hard to keep track of where everyone's at. But I've got a lot of enjoyment out of seeing where students. Their careers and where they've gone, and their enjoyment, I think, of the job they've gone into, and also that they didn't completely bomb out the first job they got. That something we taught them here must have been relevant and stuck. And it's always nice to get a little bit of feedback from them, like, "Oh yeah, I'm glad we learned that," or something. But because when you're teaching, it's you're trying to keep up to date with things that are relevant and making sure. I mean, that's one advantage of being in an extension role, is that I have a lot of interaction with winemakers and people in the industry. So what they're currently dealing with, or from a lab point of view, what are you typically measuring? Have you changed how you measure things? Are there new things that you would, so that you can kind of adapt things in the classroom level so that they're at least going to be up to date with what kind of some current practices are. So yeah, it is always nice to get a little bit of feedback about, oh yeah, I'm glad I still use that lab manual, that we have. Like, oh good, nice to feel there's some relevancy there.
We talked a little bit before the camera rolled about 2020. I'm curious about your memories of that year and of the various challenges that afflicted the industry and, of course, the world at large. Tell me about sort of the pandemic part and the harvest part. What was your role, and what was your, I don't know, how did you get through? How did you get your students through all of that?
Yeah, we were talking before about how that seemed such a long time ago, but it wasn't, and there was so much happened in a short period of time there for, certainly from a teaching point of view, some pretty dramatic changes in a very short period of time. So I teach my wine production analysis class in spring term, so that starts the end of March, and so I remember still getting emails like on a daily basis about whether we'd have to switch to teaching online, and that it was like, oh, we might need to maybe the first week of class teaching on, oh, might be the second week of class, oh, maybe, and then I think it was a week before classes started, where it was like, be prepared to teach the entire class online. So my class is a pretty lab-intensive class, so it has lectures and then 2 labs a week is the standard, 2 3-hour labs a week. So adapting to that took a lot of creativity to think about, and talking with a grad student who was my TA at the time, like figuring out how are we going to do this. And so the week before classes started, we filmed ourselves doing the lab, basically demos for the labs. So we had to decide that obviously there was not going to be any in-person labs, so how do we still get some level of training to the students? And so we had all these list of labs that the students were going to do, and so we set them up, and I filmed myself, again, one person at a time, because at that time we weren't even 2 people in a room, it was just me. So I would film myself set up with a camera on a tripod and film myself doing and narrating the lab exercises. So I'd start with, maybe doing free SO2, so adding this to this, and then you do this, and then making sure to explain why you do this and what could happen, what could go wrong, and troubleshooting, added value into that as much as I could, and trying to get as many of those done to start with. And then the other aspect of it that we tried to come up with I think a good idea to still have some aspect of a tasting to it. So part of the class, there's tastings more at a production level tasting. So not so much, oh, this is a wine from New Zealand, or this is a wine from Australia, or this is a Burgundy, or whatever. But more along the lines of, if you shift the pH in this wine, how does it affect mouthfeel? Or the sugar, how does it affect this and that? Or these are taints in wines, and training on taints and stuff. So we had quite a few lab exercises around sensory that we wanted to try and have the students at least have some exposure to that. So we ended up mailing small vials of wine to all of our students. So we made up all of the wines like we would for the sensory exercise, and put them in little vials and labeled them 1 through, I don't know, there was about 30 wines in the end. And these little 20 ml samples, and figured out how to get a permission for shipping, shipping small little alcohol samples. So 2 students, because again, students weren't able to come and pick it up, and a number of students were out of state, so they weren't necessarily in Corvallis because nobody was coming to campus. So it didn't make sense for them to come to campus to take all the online. So I've got some photos of like hundreds and hundreds of vials. So again, my TA did a great job. He labeled them all and everything, and then I poured them all and packaged them all up and then sent them off. But what it meant was that for a particular lab exercise, we're all on Zoom together, and I can say, okay, today pull out wines 1 to 4, and we could all taste the wines together and talk about them. And so it was something that at least got us a little bit closer to an interactive conversation and an in-person-ish experience. The lecturing over Zoom got tiresome pretty quick for students, and that lack of interaction there was really a challenge for everybody who was teaching during that time period. Is how do we get interaction with yourself as a teacher, but also interaction amongst the students, because that's a huge part of in-person. That's when you're in class, and particularly when you're doing things like tasting wine, and you're like, hey, describe what you're tasting, and you get this back and forth between people. That's tried to replicate that to some degree with having the shipping out the little file. So we did that. It ended up, because of just the timing with COVID, that in 2021 I had to teach the class online like that as well. We had some more opportunities there to have small 2 or 3 students at a time in the lab, so we did offer some voluntary, we couldn't make it compulsory, voluntary labs where some key kind of analyses, if you wanted to come in, we're going to run through this lab today, and so you still do it all online, but if you'd like to come in for a lab exercise, so I offered that as well. So doing lab with 2 or 3 people, and then also lecturing in person as well as over online. We have a really large lecture hall here, and so we're all set up to do that, so that if students came, they could be miles apart in the lecture there. So it was a really quick adaptation to that. I mean, literally 2 weeks, and then 1 week it's like, okay, you have to 100% be online. So initially it was like, okay, I can figure out a week of online and then push all the labs further out, and then push the labs further out so we can still be in person. And then it was like, no, they're all got to be online. So, I mean, we were successful in that sense, but it was really hard. It was tough for the students to miss that piece of their education. For most of our, not just in the knowledge and viticulture side, but also the food science and fermentation science, most of the quote-unquote fun classes, the production classes, where all of that biochemistry and organic chemistry you learned earlier and all those things, come to fruition with learning these very specific, these production level classes and stuff. They're all, in your junior and senior year. So for our seniors in particular who missed out on all of those things, it was hard. So just, I think that community sense of being together as a class and going through those things together was really missing. So 2020 for sure. We tried to do more of that by 2021. We kind of learned some lessons along the way of how to have better collaboration even in an online setting, and a number of us were teaching online, had taught and still teach online classes anyway as part of other things, and so there were lessons we could learn from them. OSU has a really strong eCampus program, and so they were able to offer some suggestions on how to get more engagement, because that was the key thing that was difficult, was engagement with the students. It's one thing to just lecture on Zoom, but how do you maintain engagement, get some questions, some discussion? That can be challenging. So yeah, it wasn't straightforward, that's for sure, and I think we all tried out to do our best to give students some of that still, but it was. I don't have fond memories. I remember it was very, very busy and doing lots of things and just kind of getting through, and and then, of course, as we headed towards harvest, thinking about and working with wine industry and a number of Zoom meetings with the broader wine industry that the Oregon Wine Board kind of helped facilitate on COVID rules in the winery and the vineyard. How do we deal with the social distancing and masking, and so how are we going to operate in the vineyard, and then how are we going to operate in the winery? And there was a lot of great sharing of ideas from companies that had kind of thought some of these things through, and so an exchange of ideas of how are you going to approach that and how we're going to do it. And certainly bigger companies versus smaller wineries, had different challenges there. And so we were all ramping up for trying to figure out all of that, and then the smoke came. So then it was all about, like, what do what are we going to do about this? What impact is this going to have? How can we adjust to this? And so, yeah, that changed focus. We still had to work within the confines of COVID and the COVID restrictions, but then now we had this added major complication of working with understanding what the exposure of smoke was what impact that was going to have, and how we could adapt to that.
So what was your role, or what was asked of you in that harvest time with the smoke? What were you able to contribute to that?
So I helped with the facilitation of some of these meetings, distribution of information. So working with colleagues here, researchers here who were working on the smoke issue, and trying to, there's resources from other places who've been dealing with smoke for a long time. So the Australians have some great resources. Even in California there was some. And so trying to kind of work on pulling that information. And so the Oregon Wine Board also kind of became like a repository of some of that information, so that we could collect into one place, like what do we know about smoke and grapes and wine, and what, how do we try to address this and deal with this. I think the major thing that I was involved with was, so there was a massive amount of testing of grapes and wine, demand for testing of grapes and wine for smoke compounds that occurred. And that quickly overwhelmed the commercial testing labs. So they were backlogged up, and basically, you couldn't count on getting any results within a month. So that became a big demand on it's huge demand in the industry for, we need to know, measure in our grapes and our wine to know what we can do. And so two researchers in this department, Dr. Michael Chen and Dr. Elizabeth Tomasino, kind of stepped up and said, we've got some of the equipment that can measure these compounds. We're not necessarily currently measuring them all the time, but we can adapt, use some current methods and adapt and dedicate this equipment to smoke analysis. And so that took a big effort on their part to do that. And so that was a big piece of how OSU responded to that. Another piece of it was we collected grapes from all around the state, and a lot of different grape varietals, to kind of get some baseline numbers on different varietals and different regions on smoke compounds in the grapes, and then also in the wine. So that was kind of a project put together really quickly, and Patty Skinkis and then other extension folk in different parts of the states are organized with growers to collect samples and either ship them here or deliver them here. And then I worked with I worked with my group to sample those grapes and hand them off to either Michael or Elizabeth, and then we did micro-fermentations on the remaining. So I think in the end we had about 80 to 90 samples that we worked with, and then we did 80 or 90 micro-fermentations, and then the wines made from there were then delivered to either Michael or Elizabeth for analysis. So that kind of gave us an opportunity, if you like, to see across grape varietals in different regions. We weren't really sure how we would use this information, but we knew it could be valuable, certainly moving forward, to have that kind of database of information. And so we coordinated to do that all. So that was all happening around harvest in a pretty short period of time, to come up with that, to work with that, to coordinate the picking up of the grapes, and then to do all the micro-fermentations. So yeah, it was a big effort. I know Elizabeth and Michael worked very long hours to get that done, and then to get the analysis done in a timely manner, so that give the industry some numbers that they could maybe make some management decisions on.
Mm-hmm. So with your kind of extension work and your connection to the wine community, did that change what they were asking of you, or what they were expecting Oregon State to be doing going forward after 2020?
I'm not sure if it changed. I think there might have been a portion of the industry that maybe became more aware of what we were doing, because there was a lot of exposure of what we're doing with the wine industry, and so there's often some core people that we work with a lot. They all come to all our events. They, very interactive, and we have a lot to do with. And then there's the broader, broadening out in the circles, broader industry who may be aware of the program here, and then others who are not, not aware of us at all. And I think overall, probably a lot of increased awareness of the program here, the researchers here, and capabilities, and also just the partnership with industry. It was a really great example of coordinating and working with industry in a real strong partnership to get that process done. It was, you guys are working on this, we're working on this, how can we do these things together and working together to get it done? So it really, I think, illustrated the strength of the connection with industry and OSU, and the research capabilities and people that we have here and how that could be utilized. So I think it really emphasized that. That's how I've seen it, and so that's, None of what happened in 2020 was a positive, but as far as moving forward with improved industry awareness and just collaborations that have grown from that, certainly that's been something that's born out of that.
So I know that you mentioned your role hadn't changed a whole lot until recently. So tell us about the recent changes to your role and what you're up to now.
Yeah. So recently, as of November 1st, I guess, was my official first day as the director of the Oregon Wine Research Institute. So I still am a professor in the food science department. I still have my research program and teaching and some extension, although those duties have been reduced so that I can take on this new administrative director role. So the Oregon Wine Research Institute is a group of scientists at OSU and the USDA, and in partnership with industry, the OWRI was formed back in 2009, I think. And the scientists all work on wine and grape, wine production, grape production, wine economics. So there's 10 scientists currently in the group, and in Department of Food Science, Department of Horticulture, Ag Economics, and then the USDA ARS. So we're kind of a group of scientists who all predominantly work on grape and wine, and the idea is that we kind of meet like a department would. We meet monthly, we have shared collaborations and goals, and so my new role is kind of to direct that group, to help manage that group, to be really to be kind of the point person from the industry point of view as well. So information funneling in through me and funneling out, if you like, from the group as well. So as far as outreach and communications that come out of the OWRI office, that's kind of one of my major goals or roles will be to look at our communications and outreach strategies, and because there is still a lot of industry who are not aware of even OSU's role in enology, viticulture, and economics research, but certainly not the OWRI as well. So they may be aware of some of our individual programs and things that are going on. But as a whole, we're not as well known as we should be. There's some really outstanding work being done by the scientists in the group, and so part of it is promoting that and looking at ways to get that information out, more communication and outreach, as well as that two-way street with industry on what's happening out there, and making sure that that's being funneled back this way. So. Yeah, it's exciting. It's a new kind of role for me, although I've been part of the OWRI since it began. And been in the industry since then as well. So, it kind of fits with the extension kind of outreach component to it, where there's a lot of interaction with industry, but also working internally now with OSU managing this group and working with the dean's office and what might come from that. So, yeah. Only been doing it for about a month, although kind of aware of the role and what it might take. So,
what made this sort of the time you wanted to take this challenge on?
Yeah, so like I said, I've been part of the group for a while now, and we have a really great group of scientists, and I really think the OWRI as a group and as an entity is really valuable for the industry and for us. So I really believe in what we're doing and wanting to move that forward. So we've gone through some different types of leadership and different ways that we've organized ourselves, and so I saw this as a good opportunity to contribute and to serve in that role, and I think, like I said, to really promote, be a bit of a cheerleader for the group, and continue to kind of work on that outreach capacity. So I still get to contribute on the research side of things and do some teaching and that, but this is kind of now, I think, opening up new opportunities to work with a broader group of industry, and as well as look for ways to enhance what we're doing within the OWRI group.
So obviously the focus is on research awareness, that kind of work. What else, as you look ahead to your first year or first couple of years in this role, what are some goals you have or some kind of outcomes you're looking for?
Yeah, I think, like I said, general awareness of the OWRI and increased engagement with industry that's a big goal, but that's a continuing, ongoing goal, and how to do that better and different avenues to do that. So communication strategies, and we'll be hiring someone to work on that and to be really to help develop a more maybe cohesive way in doing that. But that's an ongoing challenge. I think not unique to us necessarily is awareness of what we do, and then how to translate that information to stakeholders. So we serve the Oregon wine industry, and so how do we reach them more and in a more effective manner? So for me, as far as those goals, getting increased engagement and awareness of OWRI, who we are and what we do, so that if I ask someone if they heard of us, that at least they somewhat know. I mean, the OWRI, the Australian Wine Research Institute, is a great example of within the wine world anyway. If you ask, do you know who the OWRI is? They will know. They're a great resource. They've been around for a while. They're kind of a go-to. So for the Oregon industry, I'd like us to be the go-to for research-based information, for sound information. And we do a lot of work that's very Oregon-centric, that's unique to Oregon, that pertains to Oregon, and so we want to be the resource that people go to. So whether that's a Google search or whether that's just a knowledge that hey, I know where to go for this information. There's a great group down at OSU that's been working on this, or from a whatever problem might pop up. So. That's short-term and long-term is improving that, and then within the group looking at some more maybe longer-term strategic research goals, that there may be opportunities to pursue that within the group as a collaborative research projects. So some of that is coordinating with research that's already going on, but also thinking longer-term, that the longer-term projects. Sometimes as scientists we're quite good at, or a lot of it is funding driven too. There's lots of short-term problems and short-term issues that take our attention, or things that we need to work on. But then there's these overarching, maybe longer-term research goals that we also need to look at ways how do we approach that and work on those type of problems and those type of strategies. So climate change, for example, big topic, covers everything really, but like within that, how are we as a group, how can we address that and look at from an Oregon industry point of view, what are the key things there that we need to be addressing and thinking 5, 10 years, 15 years down the road, and how do we kind of address that now? So there's always this mixture of short-term research and long-term research, and I think the long-term research piece of it is a part that we can be that is one of my goals is to look at how to do that better. What do we need to do more of that long-term research?
Mm-hmm. So we talked earlier about your kind of initial impressions of Oregon, and you already mentioned obviously the massive growth since you've been here. How else has the industry evolved and changed since you've started kind of being aware of it? And as we near the end of 2023 here, what does the industry look like to you right now?
Yeah, how has it evolved and changed? I mean, apart from just the tremendous growth, I think there's definitely, and again, I don't interact with everybody, so it's based on my experiences, but definitely a lot of what I'm seeing with the wines is a lot of refinement of things versus big big changes and big swings at issues or things that might have come up. So it's a lot of understanding some of the nuances and more of the refining some of the practices in the vineyard and the winery, more so than when I started even back in 2006. There's still some of those fundamental problems and things that every now and then pop up, but they're not a continual thing. I think overall, the chances of a flawed or faulty wine are very, 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 very low. So I think the industry has done there's been a big advancement in that. And so, now it's some of these more refinement and nuances, and sometimes every now and then there's the years that throw up challenges that we have to adjust to. And then, so having that base knowledge of how to adjust to those is kind of key. So we're less kind of reactionary for some of them, but so smoke is a great example of that. The more and more we know about that, so if we ever have any issue like that widespread before, we're in a much better place now than we were a couple of years ago. I think that's been a big piece of it. I think I still see that same level of cooperation and collaboration amongst the industry, even as it's got larger and larger and larger. Again, there's still this grounding in from the very beginning. It wasn't that long ago that the Oregon industry really took off and started. So we've still got that kind of generational knowledge that's in the industry, and then now there's like a new generation coming through and working with a lot. In some of our groups and stuff, lots of assistant winemaker level, and it's really fun to see, or interesting to see the new generation of winemakers coming through, but still with that underpinning of some of the founding people of the industry are still heavily involved and active, and passing on all of their wisdom. So I think the industry is in a really Oregon industry seems to be in a very healthy place, and there's always the constraints and the pressure of markets and just this year of seeing things happen in other states that it's hard to know our place in it, but Oregon seems to be in a good place when it comes to that. And I think our focus on premium wines, on the slightly high price point, I think has placed us well in that sense. So I can see that continuing.
Well, what else do you see as you look ahead for the Oregon wine industry? Obviously, you mentioned things like climate change, things like smoke that are kind of lingering issues. What comes next for the industry? What are you sort of looking forward to, and what are some of something you're fearful of for the future of the industry?
I think adaptability is a big piece of what I mean. We've seen that it might just be the hangover from 2020, but the ability, the adaptability of the industry, which is a big strength, I think. But so adapting to what happened in 2020, the smoke, even the frost we had last year, we've been adapting and understanding that. So moving forward, increasing our understanding of some of the impacts of these things, so that again, when or if they happen, that we're again more able to adjust and adapt and learn rather than like a reactionary "what do we do now" process. So I think the industry is maturing in that sense, in that we have some people in the industry with that knowledge, and the researchers with kind of that knowledge now as well in all these different areas when these things pop up, and that's just a continual process. So as far as moving forward, I'm very optimistic about where Oregon wine is going, and where it's at. It's been exciting to see I guess it hasn't been that recent, but the amount of new Chardonnay being produced, and Chardonnay kind of taking on a new role in Oregon, and sparkling wine, another one that we see kind of became as popular and has gotten more and more popular. So there's new avenues and things to be explored. I think Chardonnay is a great example of that. Pinot is still still number one and still should be, but I think the adaptability to looking beyond just Pinot Noir as well. I think we're along the lines of, excuse me, climate change and adapting to climate change. It's not ripping up the vines and putting in new varieties. It's understanding that on the vineyard side, what adaptions and things, be it canopy management, be it soils, be it irrigation, be it whatever it might be, that we're able to adapt and still produce these the high quality wines of the style that we'd like. Things are going to shift. It's not ever going to stay the same. I mean, the wines now that we're drinking are not the same as the wines that we were drinking in 1980. But I think Pinot Noir is Oregon, and I think even with climate change and the pressures that might bring, it's the ability to adapt to what that might bring that's going to really, I think, be the key.
We talked a bit about your kind of professional goals in the new role. Tell me anything else you're looking forward to in the future, either professionally, personally, in or outside of the industry. Other plans or goals for your future?
Sure. So the other thing that's work related, but that's exciting is here at OC we have a small research and teaching winery that's been relatively unchanged for a long time, and so we've recently had the opportunity to renovate that space. And so across the street there's a big construction going on, and the building that the winery is housed in is getting completely renovated, and the winery itself is getting expanded. So when I first came here, the winery probably had not changed much since Barney Watson had started there, and it hasn't changed that much since. We've got some new equipment and some new bits and pieces, but we were in a very small space, and so that's very exciting to have a new space. It'll be about another 9 to 12 months before we're there, but a little short-term pain of making wine somewhere else for a couple of years while they do that. So that's what I'm really excited about too, because it's been a long time coming, and I can see how much it's going to benefit both our research program, but even more than that, the teaching program. So our students are really going to have some great facilities to learn winemaking in and be exposed to some new technologies. We're really trying to look at being very forward-thinking in some of the technologies that we're going to use. So that's very exciting to me, that to have a new facility in a year. So come back in a year and I can show you. But like I said, that's been a long time coming. So it's been, speaking of adaptability, we've done pretty well in our old space to adapt to what we've got. But this is going to make my life a lot easier from a winemaking point of view, and I think it's going to be a really great asset for the teaching and research program. So. Yeah, that's what else? Yeah, that's the major thing on the professional side of things, apart from this new position. Personally, my kids are both teenagers now. So like I said, my son was born a couple of months after I started here, and now he's a junior in high school. So yeah, that's all. He wants to go to OSU, so that's great. But yeah, so that's been a big change as they've moved into being teenagers, and in a year or so he'll be done with high school. So yeah, it gives you some perspective on time, etc. Being from a newborn to a junior in school, high school now. So.
Last question for you. As you look back from where you are right now, tell me something that you're proud of, or an accomplishment that kind of sits particularly high on your list.
I think it's a couple of things. One is more general versus specific, and that is just seeing particularly my graduate students who've come through the program and then go on into industry and see how successful in the things they've been doing. It really gives me pride to see that. Where they've gone, and know that I had a teeny little piece in that, hopefully, something I taught them, and in getting either training or just into the wine industry. So that's been a big source of pride to look back and like I said, now encountering students out in the industry and chatting to them about where they're at and what they're doing. On the research side of things, a couple of research is an interesting endeavor. Sometimes we're some of the things you find out by accident, and other things you try really hard to figure out and you never figure them out. And it's just the way it goes with especially exploratory research. And so a few years ago, one of the more, I think, from my perspective, professionally satisfying research results was looking at some of the interactions between malolactic bacteria and Brettanomyces spoilage. And we were looking at a project on malolactic fermentation and color, and how it impacted color. And so we were looking at some of the potential metabolism of some of the phenolic compounds by the bacteria that might impact color. And we saw some of our results that there was one particular strain of bacteria was metabolizing this one phenolic compound that it had a small role in color, but it had a bigger role in the production of spoilage compounds by Brettanomyces. So the compound is called chimeric acid. So Brettanomyces converts chimeric acid into 4-ethylphenol, which is the band-aidy, barnyardy, horsey smell that bread produces. And so through looking at it in color and just noticing this result, we started to put 2 and 2 together about if you did malolactic fermentation with this particular strain, you ended up with a lot more of this precursor compound in the wine. So then if you had a Brett infection, you got a lot more of this compound in it, so a lot more of the spoilage compound versus some of the other strains that didn't do this. So from that, we did a bit more research into looking at the different strains that might or might not do that, and ended up working with the actual malolactic fermentation companies that produce the strains, a couple of them, who now screen all of their bacteria for this trait. So it's fun to do research on the benchtop and find out these different things. It's even more rewarding and fun to see an application of it, and at this point an application by actually commercial companies. And then that's got to really, sometimes you do research and it's hard to point to an exact this is an impact of it kind of thing. It's often kind of this, we're adding to the knowledge of something, and so it's going to have an improved effect because we've added this piece of knowledge to it versus we did this, we found this, and now people do this differently. So that was one thing that I can kind of think of or point to, that's we did this, we found this, and now this is a change practice. So that's, from a researcher's point of view, gives me satisfaction and being able to think through that process. And it was, like I said, we were looking at something else, and then it was a side result, if you like, from that project, and then taking that, and then that's where we led. So fortuitous in some ways.
All right, all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover? Would you like to cover?
No, if there's anything we didn't cover, I feel like I've talked for a long time about myself, which is not always the most comfortable. No, I don't. I can't think. I think, like I said, I've really enjoyed the journey, and it was a circuit, an unusual route into the wine industry and an unusual route into academics. It certainly wasn't something that, as a teenager, I'm that's what I want to do and do it. But that's how often life happens. It's opportunities arise, or saying yes to some things and no to others, and here I am. So yeah, I've enjoyed the journey.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and sharing your story with us. Congratulations on your new role, and best of luck. And I'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.